Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Integrated Source-to-Pay Keeps Benefits Flowing Upstream and Down. My name is Richard Waugh. I'm from Zycus, and we're pleased to host this session today. And as the title implies, there will be a particular focus on the opportunities, both opportunities and challenges to apply source-to-pay best practices and technologies in the energy sector, and in particular in oil and gas. So a little bit about my background and what I do at Zycus. I'm VP of Corporate Development for Zycus and focus on areas such as new product introduction, market development, and thought leadership programs, which today's webinar would fall under. And to tell you a little bit about Zycus, just by way of context. So Zycus, we provide an integrated suite of source-to-pay procurement software that spans, there's upstream processes in the energy sector around exploration, for example, as well as downstream processes for refining and distribution. When it comes to procurement software, there's also an upstream and a downstream delineation. In the software world, it really focuses on upstream processes in the procurement space, starting with tools like spend analytics to get better insights into spending at a very granular level, eSourcing tools to effectively not only identify those opportunities, but execute sourcing projects to maximize savings potential, contract management tools to actually implement those agreements with suppliers, and supplier management tools for onboarding and measuring those suppliers' performance and effectiveness. And from a downstream standpoint, there's the more operational aspects of procurement around Procure-to-Pay. So eProcurement tools to create requisitions and purchase orders, eInvoicing to enable the settlement on the back end of those invoices for the products and services that get ordered, as well as financial savings management tools to track savings throughout the life cycle from the initial opportunity identification through realized savings. So that's what a source-to-pay suite encompasses. And by way of external market validation, if you will, in the procurement software space, the Gartner Group and their Magic Quadrant assessment tends to be one of the most reliable indicators, and they produce a Magic Quadrant for suite vendors that cover this type of a footprint. And in the latest publication of the Gartner Magic Quadrant for procurement suite vendors and sourcing suite vendors, Zycus is actually at the top of the leaders quadrant. So that's about Zycus. I want to talk about the agenda for today's session then. I want to start off with some industry challenges and key procurement focus areas really specific to energy and oil and gas. And following the process and the timeline in the energy sector in oil and gas, we'll start with exploration. And in this context, meaning what are the right benchmarks and best practices to look at to assess your own organizational performance and prioritize the right targets, areas to focus on. Then a plan for development, really identifying, plotting, and leveraging where there are synergies across the source-to-pay process. And all along the way, we want to measure the flow, meaning how can we utilize analytics to optimize the best results throughout. And in deploying these type of solutions and best practices, we want to make sure that we're producing at capacity. And that really involves a well-thought-out and executed implementation plan. And along the way, there's going to be a requirement to refine the approach. So refining and processing really means looking at a transformation program in a holistic way and planning for and addressing change management issues that come along with process and technology change. And we'll wrap up with some client case examples from the energy sector when we talk about distribution and sales, how do you establish the success criteria and measure performance on an ongoing basis? So that's the agenda for today. And just starting out at a macro level, if you will, the overall industry challenges, specifically in oil and gas. These are not a big surprise to all of you in the space, that there's been a dramatic kind of a seismic shift or a sea change, just given what's happened to the price of oil over the last couple of years. So we see that you know, the bottom really started to fall out of the market after the early peak in 2014, and has of late in 2016 recovered slightly, but still remains somewhere about 50% of the normal industry high for the price of a barrel of oil. So that obviously is going to create some dramatic changes in the underlying industry cost structure. And of course, the challenges have been created and exacerbated to some extent by the fact that, you know, supply and demand is in effect here, that supply production remains robust even with weakening global demand as some of the emerging market economies have cooled, slowing demand. Now, of late, of course, the market cartel, if you will, such as OPEC, has recognized that and made a move to limit production. But certainly the low price of oil remains a constant industry challenge, which reflects directly on procurement. So procurement has been tasked, therefore, with really enabling and enacting massive cost restructuring, which has brought about intensified focus on procurement as the best way to offset margin pressures. So both opportunities and challenges, if you will. Significant cost challenges, but that means procurement has, you know, maybe a one-time or certainly a very significant opportunity to lead the cost restructuring in the industry overall. So speaking more specifically about procurement focus areas in the energy and oil and gas sector, here's some suggestions that come from a Bain & Company report about adopting a more strategic approach to procurement in oil and gas. So looking at the sort of high-level strategic considerations, one of the things that they suggest is really focus on the supplier relationship and how to reset those supplier relationships. The suppliers, your Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 suppliers are under the same intense cost pressures, for example. So really getting a better understanding of the suppliers' cost structures is going to increase transparency and really help manage supplier risk, because one of the challenges that really has to be a focus area here is with the intense cost pressures that not only you're under but your suppliers are under, making sure that those suppliers are going to be there and be, you know, suppliers that you can rely on going forward. So really getting a better handle on supplier relationships is one of the first suggestions here that Bain provides. The other is improving CapEx efficiency. So one of the unique aspects of procurement in oil and gas is a relatively higher percentage of CapEx expenditure as compared to OPEX. And the suggestion here is that when you're experiencing a downturn, such as in the current market that the conditions have created, this is the opportunity to take advantage of a slower cycle, particularly when it regards to capital expenditures and investment, to plan for the long term and lock in some significant cost advantages. And, you know, speaking of cost, recommendation here, become more cost conscious. And that means getting better visibility to spending, better transparency, and making sure that those buy decisions, which are so critical, especially now, are the best informed ones, that they're made based on total cost of ownership, so a full assessment of cost. So some good recommendations from Bain from sort of a higher level procurement strategy. In terms of more specific challenges, with regard to the procurement processes in oil and gas, we'll kind of start with the fact that as compared to other industries, the sourcing environment in oil and gas is extremely complex. So the diverse and fragmented types of different spend categories that have to be managed, so a diverse spend tree and supplier base, the fact that it's not just about operating expenditures, there's significant expenditure for capital equipment and purchases, which tend to be more complex in terms of how those expenditures are evaluated and approved. And of course, the overall external market regulatory environment creates a number of challenges around safety and health and those kinds of things. So a complex sourcing is the number one challenge. On the downstream procurement, that operational eProcurement or Procure-to-Pay, there are also a unique set of challenges in the industry. Because of the distributed nature of the operation, so many of the users, especially requisitioners when it comes to eProcurement, are distributed out at often remote sites that don't often have reliable internet access, for example. And the fact that much of this purchasing activity is being driven on a very decentralized basis actually leads to, comparative to other industries, significantly higher maverick spend, meaning end users, maybe they don't have visibility to the preferred negotiated supplier agreements, going out and making purchases with non-approved, non-contracted vendors, leading to maverick spend and savings leakage across the board. And given to the fact that so many of the users, particularly in an eProcurement environment, are going to be non-procurement users, it really demands a very intuitive user experience to drive adoption and gain benefits. And the final area is really from a supply-based management standpoint, the fact that operations are global, the spend categories and therefore the suppliers that provide them are extremely diverse. So it poses a number of challenges. First, persistent geopolitical risk. So oil and gas companies operate typically in areas of the globe that are experiencing the most risk from a geopolitical standpoint, be they, regime changes or being prone to different kind of weather-related events. All those things spell potential risk and complexity from a supplier management standpoint. And because they're so distributed, it's very difficult, therefore, to get on a global basis that single version of truth around supplier information. And those suppliers constantly have to be monitored for risk, financial risk, especially given the pressures in the industry at the moment, but also regulatory compliance with regulations such as child labor laws, environmental safety, and carbon footprint standards as well. So given all those different challenges, we want to start our process, starting with exploration, by really doing some in-depth benchmarking and identify the best practices that are going to help make an oil and gas procurement transformation initiative the most successful that it can be. So it's always helpful to understand what the starting point is. And here I'm sharing some benchmarks, some of the key performance metrics from a sourcing and procurement standpoint provided by CAPS, which is the Center for Advanced Purchasing Studies affiliated with Arizona State University. And they look at industry by industry comparing benchmarks. So here, with a key metric such as spend under management, when you compare the petroleum industry, for example, to other industries such as aerospace or industrial manufacturing, for example, the oil and gas or petroleum industry tends to have relatively lower spend under management, so coming in at about 75% versus a manufacturer that's 88%, aerospace at 96%. So because of some of the challenges unique to the industry that I mentioned earlier, especially the fragmented nature of the purchasing and decentralized nature of purchasing activity, it's generally more challenging for oil and gas companies to increase spend under management to get to that 85, 90% or better benchmark that other industries enjoy. Likewise, from a savings standpoint, and CAPS tracks both cost reduction and cost avoidance. Certainly from a cost reduction standpoint, the historical benchmark performance in oil and gas is relatively lower, the lowest of these 5 represented here at just under 2% as compared to, for instance, over 4% in aerospace and defense. Another benchmark that's really revealing here is the amount of spend managed per supply management employee in millions of dollars. And this is an area where on the surface this might be very encouraging in that petroleum industry is much higher spend per FTE, about 25 million, which could indicate productivity, but also could indicate that relative to some of these other industries that have a much lower amount of spend managed per FTE, that relatively speaking, the supply management function may be under-resourced, as compared to engineering and construction, where a supply management FTE is managing 6.6 million or over 7 million, just over 7 million in aerospace and defense, as an example. And when it comes to supply management ROI, which is really a revealing measure of what does every dollar invested in the procurement function return to me as a business, middle of the pack, about a 6x return on the supply management investment dollar, as compared to closer to 12x, for instance, in financial services. So each individual organization, your results may vary. So these are industry averages for the petroleum industry overall. But it's certainly helpful to know where you are and where you are relative to your peer group as a starting point. So those are some performance benchmarks. We can also look at process benchmarks. Now, these are across industries, but everyone's focused on not only getting better performance, better effectiveness from procurement, but also better efficiencies when it comes to the process. How do we reduce cycle time overall? And across industries, if we look at starting with the sourcing cycle, which for more complex events tends to be somewhere in the 3 to 4 months to conduct a sourcing project, putting those negotiated agreements in place through the contracting phase often consumes about another 2 months for most organizations, and then another month on average to get suppliers onboarded and to get their invoices approved and paid. Overall, we're looking at a cycle time somewhere 6 to 7 months on average. So every opportunity to shrink that cycle time is really going to not only be reflected in increased efficiency gains in the organization, people spending less time processing transactions, for example, and more time on strategic activities, but also means the sooner those negotiated savings are actually realized and hit the budget and return the type of profit margin improvement that is so critical for procurement to drive in the industry, especially today. So thinking then about deploying a source-to-pay, a transformation program that includes technology and automation around source-to-pay, it's also helpful to kind of get some guidelines from what's been established as best practice. And these come from the Gartner Group when they look at, kind of from a clean sheet of paper standpoint, where should the prioritization be in terms of an organization trying to roll out a source-to-pay transformation and implement technology accordingly. So the recommendation as the starting point is to start with spend analytics, and it's hard to argue with it. How can you effectively implement category and sourcing strategies if you don't have good visibility to what you're buying, with whom, and in what quantity? So starting with spend data and really making sure that that data is accurately cleansed, classified, and enriched to give you the best insights into what would then be step 2, as recommended by Gartner, capitalize on those savings opportunities through an eSourcing program. So building a pipeline of cost savings opportunities, really driving adoption of eSourcing tools to increase the velocity and throughput of those sourcing projects. So just doing more events more quickly to maximize the savings opportunity. Now, as the next step, they would recommend from a best practice standpoint, once you've gotten better spend visibility, started to identify more potential savings by executing those sourcing projects, then you got to make sure that you're able to keep those savings, that they actually matriculate all the way through to the financial statements, that they're realized by putting in place compliance routines and effective compliance programs in areas such as CLM, contract lifecycle management, VMS, especially for services procurement, the vendor managed services, and Procure-to-Pay, P2P, to really drive demand through the approved buying channel and process to your preferred supplier agreements at negotiated contracted rates. So it's promoting a culture of control and responsibility and involving stakeholders in developing those category plans, workflow, and templates as a way to make sure that adoption is built into the process as you roll out compliance initiatives, especially things like Procure-to-Pay. And then the last step in this sequence is really to on an ongoing basis, make sure that you're focused on managing those supplier relationships. So you spend a lot of time and a lot of hard work to get visibility to spend, to find and contract with the best, most capable suppliers that are delivering the highest total value. Now you want to make sure that those supplier relationships are optimized and really segmenting the supplier base to understand which ones are the most critical, the most strategic, versus more transactional or tactical suppliers, as an example. So some benchmarks and best practices as the way to start the process, identify the areas of opportunity, and focus on the highest return targets. Step 2 is the plan for development. So let's think about across source-to-pay process, where are the opportunities for leverage? Where do the synergies exist? And when talking about the value of an integrated source-to-pay approach, Gartner, again, in one of their recent reports, an IT market clock for procurement and sourcing solutions, identified that there's a clear trend in the market, and that is buyers more and more have an interest in deploying an end-to-end integrated suite of source-to-pay tools for some fairly obvious reasons, that it's going to simplify their solution architecture overall. It's going to reduce the number of integration touch points back to their core ERP, those enterprise resource planning systems. And of course, having a single vendor, for instance, across source-to-pay versus multiple point solutions makes managing your technology vendors easier, the proverbial one throat to choke. So all of these are good reasons to adopt an end-to-end source-to-pay suite. But beyond these, there have to be some real synergies that justify this approach towards an end-to-end suite based on the hard dollar business case and incremental ROI that's going to be realized. So I'd like to delve into those a little bit more closely and really identify areas where an integrated source-to-pay suite creates incremental value by having a seamless process flow front to back. So starting at 12 o'clock, let's say, on our clock face with spend analytics, being able to not only utilize those analytics to bubble up kind of what the highest savings potential opportunities are, but then automatically initiate and track a sourcing project. And with the project management tools, really being able to engage a cross-functional team of stakeholders and automatically then initiate that eSourcing project, at the conclusion of which, once you've negotiated pricing and terms and conditions, that would pre-populate the contract. And that contract then establishes visibility at the point of requisition. So it's a way to make sure that negotiated preferred vendor agreements are front and center for requisitioners at that moment of truth when they have to make a buying decision about which supplier to use for a particular product or service. And in the requisitioning phase within Procure-to-Pay, not all the requests can be satisfied with an existing contracted vendor. So being able to take a requisition and automatically route it to a quotation process, because some of those requisitions now need to be sourced to identify the appropriate vendor and negotiate prices, and then update that shopping cart, that requisition, so that the order can flow through seamlessly. When it comes to supplier management, one of the other points of synergy is being able to onboard a supplier once and have them enabled for the variety of events or collaborations that you're going to conduct with that supplier. So that means gathering all their information such that you can include them on an RFQ in the sourcing phase, deliver to them a purchase order, obtain their catalog information, be able to receive an invoice or an advanced ship notice back from them, being able to populate that supplier information in the contracts themselves, being able to track key performance indicators on scorecards, et cetera. And then at the end of the day, it all sort of flows into the savings management tracking, where you're going to, really measure the actual performance against what was contracted for, what was agreed to in the sourcing cycle to close that loop. And in tracking the actual savings and the actual spend, the cycle develops again over with a new spend baseline to initiate the cycle once again as we go through. So what is that worth? The source-to-pay synergies. What are the best-in-class organizations that have deployed best-of-breed integrated source-to-pay suites? What are they realizing over and above the market overall? So again, in each of these areas, we can compare the benchmarks for best-in-class organizations to the average and see that there's a significant delta, a significant performance premium that's being extracted by best-in-class organizations. So when it comes to spend under management, best-in-class organizations are at 90%, whereas the average is only just barely north of 50%, about 53% on average, so 37 points higher. They're also able to execute more of their savings opportunities by sourcing on an annual basis about 62% of their spend, 18 points higher than the average organization. Not only that, they're able to ensure that the spending is compliant to contracts at a much higher rate. About 2/3 of spend compliant to contract, 14 points higher than their counterparts in the average or peer group. And an even higher percentage of transactions that are compliant to the contract, so nearly 3/4 in the case of the best-in-class. They've enabled more of their suppliers for electronic communication, sending, a CXML or an EDI formatted PO transaction and getting electronic invoices back from their suppliers. Best-in-class organizations have enabled 37% of their supply base for electronic transmission. So it doesn't seem like that higher percentage, but keep in mind that here the 80-20 rule is in play, that the top 20% of suppliers, generally speaking, generate 80% of the transaction volume. So the best-in-class organizations that have electronic collaboration enabled with 37% of their suppliers, in most cases are going to have the majority of their transactions electronically enabled. And of course, the big payoff is at the end of the day, what's the savings rate that's being captured? And in this area, best-in-class, once again, are realizing this performance premium, so 1 percentage point higher in spend. So an incremental 1% gain, however, when you look at $100 million in spend is $1 million in additional savings per $100 million in spend. So significant benefits being accrued by best-in-class organizations by taking advantage of the integration of source-to-pay tools across the processes. And just to underscore that a little bit more, here's some data, again, from Ardent Partners, as were the prior benchmarks that I just shared, that really focus on what are the cumulative benefits of integrated source-to-pay. So by linking together spend analytics that flows seamlessly into sourcing and into contracting, as well as the procure-to-pay, the e-procurement and payable side, there's a significant incremental gain that organizations that are adopting this approach are realizing. So for instance, by infusing sourcing projects with spend visibility, spend analytics, on a per project basis, those organizations are realizing somewhere between 24 and 41% more savings per project. And then by seamlessly linking the sourcing process to the contracting process, they're creating that visibility and accountability that reduces savings leakage by up to 38% more. And when it comes to operational procurement and procure-to-pay, their compliance rates, adoption and compliance to the procure-to-pay tools are on average more than 20% higher than those that have taken more of a piecemeal approach. And they're able to reduce the invoicing costs on the back end by up to 80% as well. So pretty dramatic benefits accrue from this kind of an integrated approach to source-to-pay. So I want to talk then about, on an ongoing basis, how are you going to use analytics to measure the flow, to really optimize your results, get to those best-in-class type of performance metrics. And it all starts with understanding spend. So for example, specific to the oil and gas sector, we'd look at how do you profile the sourcing landscape. So first, for example, really on the operating expense side, what are the major components of direct material spend, raw materials, et cetera, and components. And then on the indirect side, big drivers in oil and gas tend to be professional services spend, but also logistics, the freight and transport costs, and a multitude then of other categories on the indirect side that need to be tracked as well. All with the objective of creating commodity spend and price transparency and tracking and mitigating risk along the way as well. So just to delve into a little bit more of some best practices for spend analytics specific to oil and gas, it really means developing a custom taxonomy that will give you that deeper level view into representative categories. So just as some examples included here, whether we're talking about things more on the direct side, gases, oil and gas drilling and exploration equipment, oil and gas services, well drilling and operation equipment, those are the high level ones. And then you getting into level 2, maybe I get a little bit more specific, but really from an an effectiveness standpoint for sourcing and procurement, how do I get into level 3 and level 4 in the taxonomy to understand at a much more granular level exactly what's being purchased? That within the broad category of gases, we're really zeroing in on calcium carbide as an example. And similar examples on the indirect side, whether that's cleaning equipment, education and training, mail services, getting to that much more granular level, cleaning rags and cloths and wipes as an example, a very specific item level view of spending to be able to capitalize on that, understand where your real leverage is, and get better insights. So at the end of the day, it's really about this approach that's been the most effective in the industry, which is a hybrid taxonomy. So that means at level 1 and level 2, having broad family categories of products that are meaningful in the energy sector, in oil and gas, while at the detailed levels utilizing industry or cross-industry standards such as UNSPSC or the United Nations Standard Products and Services Code, the NAICS codes, SIC, E-Class, all these others that are included here. What we found as the best practice is a hybrid taxonomy that blends these together so that you can drill up or drill down to get the most meaningful insights from spend analytics. Now, once you've got those insights, it's about developing and executing a sourcing wave plan, because you can't tackle all those categories all at once. And here's an example from consulting firm Protiviti with a lot of expertise in the oil and gas space that really looks at how do you, in kind of a two-by-two matrix fashion, assess the ease of implementation on one axis, and on the other, what is the savings potential from low to high? So obviously, the upper right-hand portion of this matrix would be the first wave priority, where actually you'd look at the ease of implementation actually being high, and the savings potential being high, which would drive you to that segment that would say categories such as fluids, cementing, drilling services would be prioritized for the first sourcing wave. And as you look at subsequent waves, getting into some of the more complex, more difficult implementations, especially around some of the more capital-intensive equipment spend categories that might surface. You want to address them all, and you want to do that in a measured, methodical, and systematic approach. But it certainly is about identifying those gains that can be maximized, the biggest gains that can be realized the fastest, as the priority from a sourcing wave plan execution standpoint. So let's talk about producing at capacity then. Developing and executing the implementation plans. I just talked about the sourcing wave plan says that on a practical basis, most organizations can't address all spending categories at once. And the same thing applies when it comes to transforming the end-to-end source-to-pay process. That typically developing the implementation project plan for this type of initiative requires some type of a phasing approach. That includes phasing around process. Am I going to, as the Gartner best practice technology sequencing recommendation shows, do I want to follow that approach that says let's tackle spend analytics first, and then sourcing, and then contracting and supply-based, contracting, procure-to-pay, supply-based management as an example? Or are there different factors at play in your business that might change that sequencing? Another factor, of course, in phasing is the global aspect of the business. So in few cases would a big bang approach be recommended, going global all at once. So for instance, companies headquartered in North America will often start there and get real traction with their procurement transformation and their technology deployment before then introducing those best practice and best-of-breed tools to other parts of the globe, as an example. Resource planning becomes critical. Solutions such as the ones we're talking about today, delivered with cloud-based technology, fortunately significantly mitigate and minimize the reliance on internal IT support resources, as an example. But it doesn't eliminate those entirely. So resource planning to make sure that you've got the right internal resources lined up is going to be a critical best practice in planning the project and the implementation. I'll talk more about those in a quick second. And don't forget about other dependent events going on in the business and ERP integration. So as an example, is there an ERP upgrade planned that may be something that you want to have in place before tackling a deployment of a best-of-breed source-to-pay cloud-based technology, as an example. So I mentioned the resources required. This is a really critical aspect for a successful deployment. So it really starts on the client side with a program manager or business lead, having that single point of contact that they can then orchestrate and facilitate the other internal resources that you'll need to make this a success. One of which, of course, is an IT project lead. So as I mentioned, cloud-based delivery platform means that you're not installing software on your servers. You're not having to deal with the upgrade management process and those kinds of things. So IT involvement is significantly minimized in a cloud deployment, but still a critical input to the process. They're the ones who have the access and the expertise around how these tools will need to integrate and interface with your existing enterprise systems. And of course, critical across source-to-pay are the subject matter experts, and you may have different ones. There's a different subject matter expert when it comes to the requisitioning process, maybe a different expert in accounts payable to really understand the current as-is process for invoice approval and payments. Across the board, you're going to have different category experts that need to be engaged in this process, not for significant periods of time. Their applied effort is not going to be critical, but from a planning standpoint, it's critical to get that expertise up front in the process so that those detailed requirements are built into the configuration of your solutions that ultimately get deployed. And across functions, you're really looking at not only the sourcing and procurement team, but key representatives, finance, legal, accounts payable, and other functional groups as well. So you have a project plan. You've got a prioritized schedule of a phased implementation and rollout. It's important as well to deal with the inevitability of change management when you're talking about a transformation that's going to change processes, it's going to change technology. It's also going to change behaviors. And planning for and addressing change management along the way is an important refinement in our process. Some best practices here to share as well. Executive sponsorship is a must. This is sort of a given, but especially on a project of the magnitude of an end-to-end source-to-pay process. You're really going to be not just impacting the procurement function, but especially with tools like Supplier Management, like Procure-to-Pay, you're getting involved with users that are going to span different functional areas of the business. So executive sponsorship at the top, but those key stakeholders that I just mentioned involved upfront in the solution selection and configuration decisions so that they're part of the process, that they feel invested and vested in the program's success. Another key best practice that we've seen that's often overlooked is to get some internal buzz around the program, things like branding the initiative, with something that's catchy and memorable. One client, for example, has branded their project as Shop. So it's a very descriptive brand name, for example, that users that are going to come in are into an e-procurement tool, in this case, are there to shop, so that they recognize sort of what the purpose is, and you can then promote the successes of the program going forward to build that momentum and buy-in across the organization by showcasing those benefits. And don't forget to pay attention to the individual. So it's not just that the benefits that accrue to the company in terms of savings, which can drive earnings per share and those kinds of things. Those are important, but it's also important to deal with at the individual user level. How does this make my job easier, make my life easier? What's in it for me? And the final recommendation here from a change management standpoint is train habitually. So when it comes to a number of these initiatives, sometimes they're launched with a lot of fanfare. There's an initial training class, but the absorption rate, is for any type of traditional training is notoriously low. That we often forget what we've just learned when months down the road it may be the first time that I need to go place a requisition or approve an invoice, for example. So the systems and technologies need to provide real-time online training and refreshers that provide that self-paced training or real-time chat support so that at that moment of need I have the reinforcement to make me comfortable utilizing the technology to get the full benefit. So as we get to distribution and sales, how do we establish success criteria and measure performance? And this is an area where I just wanted to share some examples of what clients in the energy, the oil and gas sector are realizing in terms of benefits across source-to-pay transformation. So, starting sort of at the recommended starting point, going back to the Gartner model with spend analytics leading into sourcing. Example here is a client that's a global oil and natural gas provider that started with very challenging environment because of the lack of transparency. They actually have increased with the spend analytics tools spend visibility by over 200%. So that means in this case, accurately classifying and categorizing a significant volume of spend, over $8 billion in spend, to a very granular level, allowing them not only to have more spend under management, but to actually source more of that spend more frequently and more effectively. When we get into the areas of contract and supplier performance management, case example here from a public utility that, like many of the companies in the sector, utilizes a significant number of contractors as well as employees. And those contractors are often filling very crucial roles to the business. So they needed to make sure that they could, from a contract management standpoint, put in place the appropriate access controls and permissions to provision those contracts to the right employees that need to have access, as well as to the right contractors to view those critical agreements that they need access to, but only those, so that they can restrict access as required so that the right people get the right information at the right time. So in this case, that means, well over 1,000 contracts across not only employee base, but also over 3,800 contractors, and tracking then supplier performance with the most strategic suppliers on a very frequent basis. Another example in the area of supplier information management is from an oil producer that's of a very significant global scale. So we're talking about onboarding and managing supplier information for over 50,000 global suppliers with more than 1,000 users within the enterprise that have to touch that supplier information. And the onboarding process itself, given the global nature of the business and the challenging regulatory environment, means that being able to automate a fairly significant workflow process that could have up to 20 to 30 steps in a conditional workflow logic. So being able to take that complexity and configure into an automated solution, the ease of use that makes that process much more streamlined and effective. And as a part and parcel of that, being able to perform 360-degree regulatory risk reviews around those suppliers, those 50,000 plus suppliers that get onboarded. In the procure-to-pay space, one of the particular challenges that one of our clients, a global oil field services firm, faced was purchasing was decentralized, and the users were at often remote locations with very unreliable internet connections, so dial-up kind of internet connections at 128 kb, for example, and they needed to ensure and were able to ensure that even at lower speeds, suppliers were getting the type of performance that drove real adoption across the user base. And sort of bringing it all home in the area of financial savings management, example here is an energy and industrial conglomerate tracking savings projects at a very high volume, so over 24,000 savings projects that roll up at multiple levels across the business. So certainly at the highest level being corporate, but that encompasses 11 business units, 1,400 unique entities, and 1,300 users that get engaged in savings project tracking, not only procurement, but other functional stakeholders and certainly finance, to be able to sign off on and approve savings projects such that the organization can effectively track and project what the savings impact of their source-to-pay initiatives will be on a very global scale. So those are some real-world examples of how customers in the oil and gas sector have been deploying best-of-breed technologies for source-to-pay and recognizing best-in-class type results. And with that, I'm going to conclude today's webinar. Thank everyone for joining. Please join us for additional webinar topics in the future, and please feel free to send any comments or questions our way. We appreciate the feedback. Thanks everyone for joining the session today.